world leaders have been gathering in various hotspots around the world to discuss all of the issues that are facing all of us. It doesn't matter if it's the climate or Ukraine or what North Korea is up to. It seems like the world is just a little bit off its axis these days, and it's troubling. So we turn to Ambassador Bob Rae, appointed as Canada's ambassador to the United Nations in 2020. The timing was maybe not great. We'll talk about that in just a moment. You will know that he was the only NDP premier ever of the province of Ontario and was interim leader of the federal Liberals for a while. He did many other things in his life and comes from a diplomatic family, so it seemed only fitting that he would somehow land back in New York at the UN. Did your father, Bob, actually have the job, or was he part of the UN contingent?
No, he had the job. He was ambassador here for 4 years, between 1972 and 1976, and he also was ambassador in Geneva at the United Nations, their offices there in the 1960s, which is where I also went to high school. So, although I didn't put that in too many pamphlets when I was running for political office.
I bet you didn't. But
in Toronto.
This is kind of a really nice full circle, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. At a personal level, that's exactly how it feels.
Yeah.
And I had a wonderful conversation yesterday with Harold Coe from Yale and Rosalie Abella,
right,
who's teaching at Harvard, and we did a seminar together. And Harold's background is very similar to mine. His father was a diplomat, and he had a lifelong interest in international law. And it is full circle for me, and it's been wonderful to be able to engage in New York, and I think to use kind of the range of political and other skills that I've developed over the years, and be able to engage, I hope, effectively here.
That's what I felt like when I went in as consul general. It was the same kind of inauspicious timing, right? Right after 9/11, you were coming in at, the pandemic was about to unfold, and Donald Trump and Brexit, and there were so many different things. But the skill set that you bring is really important. You don't want to be a first timer going into those jobs.
No, and I think in some ways I've had the benefit of a range of experiences that allow me to work in Ottawa effectively with many ministers and departments that are engaged naturally in what goes on at the UN, and it's also allowed me to work, I think, well. I mean, I feel that I have no problem connecting with people about what the issues are. The challenge always is, well, what the hell do we do about them? And that's never easy anyway. So
that's sort of my starting point was, people always say if the UN didn't exist, we'd have to invent it. Is that still really true?
Well, I think so, because I think an awful lot has happened since 1945. I mean, the extent of decolonization, explosion of the global economy, the emergence of China as a world power, so many other things have happened since that were never imagined fully in 1945 when the UN was created. But the idea was to try to create a place where people would come and be able to meet, and also where we'd be able to address not only political and security issues, but also economic and social and trade and all kinds of other issues, including human rights and the role of international law. And some of the ambition was in the charter, the document, but the actual institutions that would do these things were still not fully created. And so I compare it, and maybe this is a little too, I don't know, some portentous or something. I compare it to sort of like we're building a cathedral here, and this is not something that happens in a year or in 10 or 15 or 20. And we have to have a sense that we're part of a process by which global institutions are going to be strengthened. And I believe that's true. I think that really is inexorable, that there will have to be stronger global institutions. And much of what is happening on climate change, what's happening on global security issues, what's happening on global development, all these things point to a way in which we have to strengthen not weaken global institutions. And those institutions exist under the umbrella of the United Nations, which is
but in the
the organ that gives it rise.
But in the big picture, you look at the United Nations, and you've got, Russia and China on the Security Council with vetoes. There's no way to change that really under the UN Charter. And these are the two real problematic issues. I think you've said, and others have said it, that Putin will go down as the world's most horrendous war criminal in history, and China, is doing everything, including breaking into our election system and affecting outcomes. Are these people that we can really do business with, whatever, in this global context? Should we be?
Well, when you say do business with, those are decisions that we make on a bilateral basis, to what extent we engage or disengage. But the fact of the matter is that it is not going to be possible to make progress, for example, on climate change, unless we engage with China. The simple fact of the matter is China is now the world's largest emitter of carbon emissions. So if you say, well, we're not going to talk to China, you say, well, okay, you can forget about making any progress on climate change, and we can argue, if you like, about whether that's worth our time or not. But I happen to think that it is, and that therefore you've got to embrace and engage China. The fact of the matter is that the United Nations reflects the world. I mean, the structure you mentioned of the vetoes were a terrible idea at the time,
and still are,
and they still are. And so, yeah, do they hinder the ability of the UN Security Council, which is the only place that the vetoes actually are used? Does it hinder the ability of the Security Council to address global issues? Absolutely. And that's been true since 1945. One of the reasons we created NATO in 1948-49 was because we knew that, in fact, while we had this UN organization, the Russians and Soviets were doing terrible things in Eastern Europe. And so we needed to create a security organization that would be working in our own interests, faced with that aggression in Eastern Europe. So, the fact that the UN is imperfect and you've got to create other institutions to go around it doesn't mean that the whole thing is a waste of time, because there's still a lot of ways in which we use the UN as a place where we try to get some things done, and also where we actually try to make international law something that has impact, which I think is in our interest too.
You have been refreshingly blunt in your statements there, because certainly career diplomats don't tend to do that, and people from other countries don't tend to do that quite as much. But to what end? I mean, that kind of makes somebody like me feel better when I hear you speaking very directly about a situation like Ukraine. But what do you do? Like, I was just rereading this morning some words from Rick Hillier, one of our former generals, long serving. If platitudes were air defense missiles, if praise were anti-tank rockets, applause was fighters, and wishes and prayers were weapons, Zelensky would be having a Victory Day parade. Like, the talk shop, the platitudes, it's all good, and it's good that you're out there, but have we changed a damn thing?
I don't think platitudes, I can be accused of a lot of things. I've tried not to make platitudes. I tried to create
I know
a framework for policymaking and for decisions. And we use words to communicate. So if we either use words to communicate reality as we see it and to describe it as we see it, or we use words to hide and to obfuscate and to fog up and to make life more difficult. So the fact that the UN is a place where words are used is no different than, frankly, what Rick Hillier does. And if words help decision makers to make decisions to supply Ukraine with the weapons that it needs and to assist in blocking what it is the Russians want to do, then those words are, I would think, helpful. And I mean, there are all kinds of people who call themselves as, men of action or women of actions, or people who only make decisions. And you say, yeah, but it's pretty hard to do that without thinking and without speaking. And so the thoughts we have and the words we use to describe those thoughts are what drive our ability to decide things and to make decisions and to change people's minds and to tell people why we're doing things and why we're not doing things. So I'm not one of those people who thinks that speech is unimportant. I think it is a way for us
Yeah,
to
I
really
don't
try
think.
to change the dynamic.
Yeah, I don't think it's unimportant. I'm not suggesting that. It's just that we're watching, for example, this week, this is not on you, nor were my words aimed that way, but the leaders travel halfway around the world, and they have they deliver a prescripted, comment at the end of the day that the situation in Ukraine is unacceptable. The climate situation is dire and more action must be taken. It seems that at a time and place, those kinds of words might have had some impact. But I think in the world we have now, the 24/7 internet world where everybody has an opinion on everything, all 8 billion of us, that they kind of lose impact, that actions do speak a little louder.
Yeah, of course. I mean, actions are critical. The words alone mean nothing. I mean, the words alone are an indication of what people are thinking, but the fact that people don't act is itself even more eloquent. So the actions, I mean, if what you're saying is actions matter more than words, I'd be the last person to disagree with that. But I don't know how else to express my concern about inactivity on certain things unless I use words.
Yeah.
And that's why I think it's important. I also think meeting in person is important. It is actually important. I think the Bali meetings were in the way in which they took place and the orchestration around them. I think a lot happened at Bali. I don't think Bali was a waste of time. I don't think Sharm el Sheikh is a waste of time. I think what we need to understand, however, is that it's the decisions that come out of that will actually make a difference. So I think the significance of the 3-hour meeting between President Biden and President Xi of China, and the fact that they covered a lot of ground, that it was obviously a very substantive meeting, I think that's important. And it wouldn't have happened unless they'd been there and actually exchanged points of view and said, okay, we'll see what happens as a result of that. But nevertheless, it's an indication that people are making some kind of an effort to see whether there can be more engagement on climate change, whether there can be a better understanding of what the so-called red lines are with respect to Taiwan and with respect to Ukraine and all the other critical issues that are at play. I mean, as you said at your introduction, we're in a very difficult and precarious time at the moment. The world crisis that we're experiencing are hugely consequential. COVID has been extremely consequential for the world. Climate change is consequential. And the level of conflict in the world, both in Ukraine and in Africa and the Middle East and other places, is disruptive. These are truly disruptive forces. So the more we are able to engage in trying to deal with the consequences that they're having, the better off we are.
Okay, so let's just take, of course, we're going to talk about Ukraine. So let's look at that. The West could have done, and perhaps should have done, much more, much earlier. I mean, it's not that we were surprised. We watched Crimea, we watched all of these other places. Why do you think we sat back?
Well, I mean, you and I go back a long way, so I've learned from being interviewed by reporters, and you're not a reporter anymore, but whenever, we're getting into questions and answers, I don't necessarily accept the assumptions of your question. But having said that, I think we have to answer. I think we have to answer the challenge. I think the world made the mistake, despite the evidence to the contrary, that President Putin's geographic appetite was limited to Crimea. And I think a decision was made by a whole different set of actors that are in government at the moment, both in Canada and elsewhere, that Crimea was not going to create a military response of any kind from the West. However, I think in fairness, it should be said that both Prime Minister Harper and Prime Minister Trudeau agreed that one thing we would do would be to engage in a much more systematic training and upgrading of the technical skills of the Ukrainian army. And I happen to think that that was a critical decision that was made, not just by us. The Brits made it, other NATO partners made it, but we definitely made it. And I think that engagement with the Ukrainian armed forces has been extremely consequential. I think it's helped to make it a different kind of army and able to respond in very different ways. But
had we had more stuff ready to go and sitting in the border countries, yes, we did some good things. And
look, Pam, you're not wrong, of course. And it's not. We're not just speaking about Canada here. This is about all of the countries involved. Yeah. I think it's true, and I think it's true to say that we underestimated the extent of the Russian attack at the beginning. Right. I can remember debating with December and January with a whole number of different diplomats in New York to what extent this was something that Putin was really going to do, or was this just a matter of showing that he was serious and trying to put more pressure on Ukraine to change its basic stance and position with respect to the areas in the eastern part of the country. And I think it's important to appreciate the fact that the extent of the Russian attack was underestimated. The fact that he mobilized as many troops as he did and tried to attack Kiev head on was not taken sufficiently seriously. What's amazing is that the Ukrainian army and Western responses and support for Ukraine were sufficient to push him back at that point, which I think was a remarkable military success for Ukraine, but also a huge political message to everybody else. The Russian government is clearly unhinged at this point, and the stakes of the war are much, much higher. And it's at that point that I think you saw a significant mobilization and coordination on the part of NATO of the kinds of efforts that we would make to supplying the Ukrainian army. At the same time, it has to be understood that there was, at the very highest levels of NATO and at the very highest levels of the militaries in every and political governments in every NATO country, was to say, we do not want to broaden the war, and we do not want this to turn into any kind of nuclear risk for the world. And so I think it's fair to say that the response was gauged to say, we will support Ukraine to defend itself. We will not engage in any other form of aggressive behavior. And we will also engage in extensive sanctions. And so our arming the Ukrainians, are continuing to provide training, which we're still doing, and our sanctions policy, plus the extraordinary humanitarian effort that we made once it became clear how devastating the bombing would be in eastern Ukraine and elsewhere, has been unprecedented. I mean, I don't know how you can say the amount of money that's been spent, but not just the money that's been spent, the level and degree of support and the extent of the sanctions against Russia. I don't think you can say it's not a formidable effort on the part of everyone. And I think, frankly, the dynamic of the debate within NATO and elsewhere has significantly changed. I think everybody understands now that this is a war conducted by Russia, which they should not be allowed to win. And I think I can make that statement without somebody phoning me up from Ottawa saying, "Oh my goodness, are you sure that's what you want to say?" And I say, "Yeah, I'm sure that's what I want to say." And be
Whether
interested
you
to hear
do is another issue.
anybody else wants to say the same. That's something else. But I'm going to say it, and I think it's important for us to come to grips with the meaning of that sentence. The risk that we would run in letting Russia get away with this would be just too great, I think, even to calculate.
Okay, I've got three questions that are related, and it's not just about Canada. It's about your views of this as a person with like vast range of experience. So, one of the questions is understanding the enemy, whoever they might be in any situation, China or Russia or whatever it is, and that we focus on their intentions, what they're setting out to do, rather than kind of understanding the motivation always. And I think those are kind of two things. As we've witnessed recently in our country with the role of the Chinese that I've already mentioned, interfering with elections, etc. Are we too naive? And I don't mean Canada, I mean almost in the West, but us particularly, about how the bad guys are doing what they're doing in the world, that somehow we've still got that Boy Scout, oh, well, we're just going to have a conversation and I'm sure we'll work it out. That was everybody's frustration around the Two Michaels situation, that somehow we weren't going to say anything really tough out loud. But to take it back to that intentions, motivation, do we have the kind of intelligence we need to be operating in this very complicated world that we're now in?
Well, we're certainly getting there. I mean, I think that the Five Eyes relationship that we have with our allies in the UK and the US and Australia and New Zealand, I think it's a very serious relationship, sometimes underestimated by Canadians and not necessarily widely enough understood. I think our intelligence establishment is becoming increasingly sophisticated, well-funded, and very directly related to these other institutions. And there's no reason why any of this it's not a secret, no reason why it should be a secret. We are, through our cooperations on cyber with our allies, we have a very good handle on what various other countries are up to, and I would stress that when you mustn't limit it to Russia and China. I mean,
no, exactly.
What is Iran up to? What are the Saudis up to? I mean, a whole bunch of people, with some of whom we have more or less friendly relations, but others we don't. In the case of Iran. And therefore, we need to understand what they're doing, because we understand with Iran, it's a regional player. It's up to a whole bunch of other things. We have other relationships, for example, with the Israelis and others, that allows us to see and hear from a range of perspectives. And I think it's allowed us to become increasingly aware and also increasingly engaged with other countries about.
So maybe we just don't talk about it. I mean, the Americans.
I think that's true. I think that's true. I think that is true. And I do think that I don't know how to say this without sounding too obscure. I do think that the institutional capacity that we have, both in terms of intelligence, policy coordination in Ottawa and elsewhere, as well as decisions that we make about where we're going to engage militarily and how we combine what we do militarily. I think those are decisions that are being made as we speak, and that will continue to be made by government. And I think it speaks to the need for us to be aware of the increasingly challenging security environment in which we're working. I think this is something that's in evolution, as to how do you respond effectively. And here I'm going to pay you a compliment, because I think that the work that you did together with John Manley and others on Afghanistan really helped to get us to focus on if we're sending our troops in and we're losing as many as we're losing, we need to really understand what the hell this conflict is all about, and how do we make sure that government is giving it the attention and time and focused coordination that needs to happen. And that's when we set up the Afghan task force. And that, as a result of your report, that's when we set up insistence that foreign affairs and defense and diplomacy, development all had to be working together, that we needed to have a joined up approach. And one of my concerns is we mustn't lose that institutional memory. One of the advantages of having a bit of I can't say a bit of gray hair because I'm all white hair now. I mean, forget the gray.
Well, I have none, of course. Yeah.
but I don't have the name of your hairdresser. But I think it's important for us to realize that we need to draw from that experience. And I was actually discussing that with the Vice Admiral Octoloni, who came here to talk about the security interests, and so it's been on my mind this morning. And just to say that we really need to think about how do we take that institutional experience that we've had and say, look, let's really put this to use again. It's not as if we can afford to put it in a shelf or in a corner and say that was then, that's when we were in the middle of a conflict, we don't need that anymore. You said, say, no, guys, this is we're not in a what the military call a kinetic conflict everywhere. We're in a significant cyber conflict, which we need to be much more aware of, and Canadians themselves need to be much more aware of the extent to which we are living in the world with a number of surveillance states that are interested in surveilling everything we do, and they're desperately trying to do it every day, every second. I don't think enough people are aware of that.
No, exactly. And that's the whole conversation about whether as a country, whether our leaders talk about that too, because part of our job for those who have served in public office, as you well know, is to educate as well, right? To explain to people how government works. I mean, I think you were talking about the UN one day. I heard this on another in a conversation I had with Paul Wells, that you kind of see your work as like going to school. Every 45 minutes you change classes and go down the hallway, and then you sit down and you go from social studies to math to English, and that's, you know, we do have this kind of I don't know, short attention span that we have, because there's so many things we have to deal with. That's on your plate, but there's a whole lot of other things that go on behind the scenes. But if we don't kind of bring the public along, I mean, I guess this is on my mind because I'm also, you might not be seeing it there, although I know you can get Canadian TV, but you know, what's going on at the Emergencies Act inquiry, when you take a look behind the curtain, the left hand did not know what the right hand was doing, and people were saying stuff with no basis. And that's the kind of thing that undermines trust in institutions, everything from the police to government to all of that. And we're already battling that pretty seriously.
But I think that, you know, I mean, I'm certainly not going to comment on the inquiry.
No, I know.
That has to be allowed to do its job. But I think one of the results frankly, one of the results of having an inquiry is that it then says, okay, what did we do wrong and what did we do right? And nobody should ever be ashamed of learning from, you know, I mean, I've spent my entire life, you know, learning how to play the violin in public. I mean, I haven't had the opportunity to say, well, you know, that didn't happen, because they can say, well, actually, we can see it on the screen, so it did happen. You did say that, and you have to admit all the time that it's a learning exercise. But I do think we should be trying to think through more carefully now. What are the lessons from the crisis of the last 3 years that we've been living through? And what does it mean in terms of institutional change, policy change? Why would we be afraid to say that what we've learned now is there's a lot more that needs to be done here. And we've learned how it has to be coordinated better, and people have to learn how to share information.
Right.
I felt from my earliest days in politics, and certainly from my time in government in Ontario, that the greatest difficulty with communication is assuming that it's already happened. I mean, I can't tell you the number of times that people would come to a cabinet meeting and say, "Well, as you know, Premier," I said, "I didn't know that. You never told me before. How am I supposed to know by intuition?" So we've tried to break down the silos in government, and the silos in government is a huge problem. As it is in any big organization, as it is in. If I was talking to the head of General Motors or the head of a bank, I would say, "Do you have a silos problem?" And they would just let me know exactly. They don't know what's going on either, and so it's a challenge for every organization.
And we have to. I mean, to your point about politics, not only education, but to change our mind. Whenever a politician changes their mind, we go, "Oh my God, 180, they're so inconsistent. They don't believe what they said they believe." Actually, you should change your mind because you should be getting new stuff on board.
Right. No, I agree with that entirely. So, I mean, I try to do that too. I mean, I often quite disarmingly say to people, "I was wrong about that, but now I think this." So, maybe you can enlighten me.
When we look at the last couple of years, and it has been crazy, the pandemic, what I think our country went through with the two Michaels, the Ukraine situation, I guess the general reaction to that is, why are we so slow? Why does it take so long to react, to respond? And it's different in all of those cases. But it just seems like there's a lethargy, or maybe it's fear, or maybe it's lack of experience. I don't know what it is, but in the business world, if something happens, you got to just jump on it that day. If your product is dangerous, you get it off the shelf tomorrow. Like you just have to react. Whereas we seem to be slow. Why? Do you have any thoughts on that? Like, why?
I don't think it's slow. I think it's deliberate, in the sense of I think it's a process. I think it's a process of deliberation. On the two Michael situation, once a series of decisions were made, the most important one being that we would follow what we felt was the rule of law in our own country, and allow the extradition process to go forward. In taking every one of those decisions, they had consequences with respect to what else we could just do. And frankly, what impressed me about the government and watching the governing process, first of all from the outside and then from the inside, was that the government had a very clear idea where it was going, and it did not feel that communicating this on a daily basis was a good idea, because it was a very delicate negotiation. And so I don't think there was any lethargy. I mean, it wasn't as if people weren't. I mean, the Prime Minister was waking up to this situation every single day, and he was thinking about it all the time, and he was trusting very capable people in Beijing and in Washington and in Ottawa to get us through to the point where it was going to be a successful result. So I don't buy the lethargy argument. I think the reality is there are two kinds of thinking. I mean, there are many kinds of thinking, but there's impulsive thinking, which tends to lead you in this day and age to responding, as you said, very quickly. Yeah, you say yeah, but sometimes that can be very impulsive, and sometimes can lead to the wrong decision.
Yep.
So you then have to say, how do you think more consequentially about what you're doing, and then understand that, and you can't always do everything with full you can't. Sometimes you have to make decisions.
Yeah.
But I don't think that in Ukraine, I don't think it's been lethargic, and I don't think it's been only. I mean, one of the complications with Ukraine is Canada's not about to make a decision on Ukraine that's completely different from what everybody else is doing, and a lot of these things are set in a NATO discussion or within a G7 discussion or some other discussion, which
Right.
makes it harder. Now, having said all that, do I sometimes get frustrated with how long things take? Sure. And sometimes I think it doesn't have to be quite that long. You know, maybe you could bring it to the fore, but I don't think this is any different than a discussion that you would have had about Mackenzie King in World War II or something. I mean, this is just some politicians, some governments like to do things in a certain way and others do it in a different way. But it's not because it's just lethargy or fear. I don't think lethargy or fear play into it.
Yeah, it's not so much that, it just seems the inability of governments to respond to things. And I know you can't make a decision off the cuff. We don't want those kinds of Donald Trump tweets running the world. I understand that, but it's just I guess about the machinery of government that it sometimes grinds slowly.
Well, I think the thing that I've learned about the machinery of government is the machinery of government is a real thing. And you have to one of the things you learn in politics and in government is how do you make it work for you? How do you make it work for the government? Because if you don't drive the machine in a certain direction and you don't give it certain direction, then it will just not move. It will just grind, and they'll set up. I mean, I used to turn, I get cold sweats when somebody would come in and say, "Don't worry about it, Premier. We've just set up an interdepartmental committee." And I said, no, please don't do that because it'll go nowhere. I know what'll happen. And it took me a couple of years to really realize that this was just another technique of saying we're going to send it off into the Netherlands of netherworld.
No, it's true. I mean, that was your point about the Afghan report that we did. We had a really limited window.
Yeah.
We answered the questions that were asked. We didn't, navel gaze or do anything else. It's just, and you're right. That is kind of a template that I think could and should be used again.
And to be fair to this government, because I know you've got your own views about this government, which are not my views. I think if you look at something like the NAFTA discussions with President Trump, I think they were handled brilliantly. I mean, I think that when the government is focused on that question and knows that it can't afford to get this, it can't get this thing wrong. It's very important. It's critically important. And you're dealing with an irrational force in Washington that you never know what President Trump was going to wake up to one day or another, or what he was going to say. You had to figure out, how do we handle this? And I frankly think the government handled it extremely well.
And they had a good ambassador in Washington.
Well, he has a good ambassador in Washington. He has an excellent ambassador in Washington. And she's a great friend of mine, and she's doing a fantastic job. But the thing you learned is but she wasn't acting on her own. She was acting as part of a broader team.
And David McNaughton before,
other people, and Christian Freeland were doing it. But I think the critical thing is to appreciate the fact. I mean, one of the realities that we have today is that there are a number of disruptive forces which are hard to manage at the best of times, and now we're into a situation which requires far more coordination and connection between foreign and domestic, international, global, and I'm sure that everybody's thinking about, well, what does that mean for us? Like, how do we manage this as we go forward? Because it's not smooth sailing.
You said at the beginning, and I have many more questions, but we're just going to have you back at another time, because I want to get into something you started, the point you made at the beginning, which is more now than ever, we need global organizations. We need multilateral organizations at a time when there's a lot of pressure the other way. where people are seeking more domestic responses to things. And in many ways, the pandemic really put a light on that. You know, we figured out we didn't make any masks, and we didn't have any, and we didn't make any vaccine. And so people quite rightly sort of turned inward and said, we better get our own house in order. Those two things aren't necessarily mutually exclusive, but just make your case for why you think global decision making is going to work in this particular time and place.
Well, just to emphasize what you just said, it's not one or the other. I mean, to believe, I mean, COVID is not a exclusively Canadian phenomenon.
No, exactly. Yeah.
So, and neither is climate change. So you look at these, take these two as an example, and then you add the conflict and cyber disruption and, you know, all the other things we can talk about. And you say, look, you need a strong domestic response. You need, and obviously it's going to be driven by a domestic political lens. I get that. I mean, I'm not suggesting that we lay down everything and just say, let's build a better UN. No, not at all. It's just that you're not actually going to be able to solve the domestic problem and the cause and effect of it unless you're globally engaged, unless you have global institutions that are functional and effective and working, because these are not purely national issues. The air doesn't suddenly stop at the American border. I mean, it's the reason we used to call it global warming is because it's global. It's global warming. A global pandemic is a global pandemic. So if you don't have the international global institutions to deal with it, you're not going to deal with it. You're going to react to it. You're going to respond. You're going to try to protect yourself from the impacts.
Yeah.
But I worry about the growth of protectionist thinking everywhere, in our own country, in the United States, the UK, Europe, you name it, because ultimately it's self-defeating, because everybody else says, okay, oh, you're going to go hibernate, I'm going to go hibernate. And then the problem doesn't go away. So what this means in actual terms is that if we'd say, well, we're pulling away from global institutions because we're not happy with what they're doing here or there, you know who will take over those institutions? The countries that say, oh, I mean, I can just drive in here and run this place. Yeah. I mean, that's what that was Donald Trump's major strategic mistake with the World Health Organization. Pulling away from the World Health Organization was a way for a number of other actors to say, well, if you're pulling away, we'll jump in with 2 feet. And then it becomes more and more like us, which is not what we want. We don't want the world to look like any other country. We want the world to look like the interests where everybody's.
But that's a real case in point. I mean, the WHO with the light shone on it. And again, it's back to this issue of its ability to react and respond in a timely manner, especially in the middle of a global crisis, is that we kind of, we saw these organizations and we went, boy, are you really up to the job? This is tough stuff. That's not a reason to abandon the field. It's a reason to say, you got to pick up your socks here. We got to improve it. And that means we've got to do more to support you, because like every other multinational organization, the WHO is only as good as the member states who are willing to contribute to it and to drive to make it better. So the answer to poor global governance of any institution is not to say, well, to hell with you. It's to say, we've got to fix this. Yeah. And that's the spirit that I keep trying to come back to, is to say our engagement has to be, we're trying to fix these things. I don't believe that every UN conversation is, a positive one, or that I don't believe that every UN institution is working perfectly. Not at all. It's that we have to be committed to making them better, because the alternative to that is that somebody else will fashion them to their own liking. And I'm seeing signs of that everywhere. Just as when we abandon fields of conflict, we say these fields are too complicated for us, others will move in. And we need to understand that. Just say the word Afghanistan and it'll prove you right. There you go. Thank you so much, Ambassador Sir.
Thank you, Pam. Good to talk to you. Pleasure.
Yeah, it was really an interesting conversation, and I want to come back and do it all again on the whole environment stuff. So
sure. My pleasure.
We'll do that another day.
Look
Bob
forward to
Rae,
it.
Canada's ambassador to the United Nations, and of course, a longtime political player in Canada and a very effective and motivated one. So we thank you for your service.
Thank you so much. Good to talk to you.
We'll talk soon. That is it for No Nonsense with Pamela Wallin, and we'll see you soon.